He had been hired to make the crystals shine, not to make life-and-death decisions. The private dining room at the Celestia, the city's most photographed restaurant, smelled that night of lemon oil and butter, of polished brass, and the faint metallic tang that comes from being very clean. A chandelier threw prisms across the tablecloths. The white-gloved staff moved like choreography. Laughter spilled through the folding doors in conversational bubbles. Outside, the strip's neon made the windows blush. Inside, nobody saw the janitor. Adam Cooper knelt in the quiet back corridor with a mop bucket at his side, watching his reflection trail across a brass service cart. He was 38, broad-shouldered from years of lifting trash bins and shifting tables, but there was an EMT's quiet in the way he held himself, an economy of motion, a readiness. His hands were small, bruise-scarred, palms weathered and warm. His jacket smelled faintly of disinfectant and night air. Behind his left ear was the thin silver wire of a hearing aid he'd been putting off replacing. He liked the hush between the evening rush and the late-night crowd, the echo of his mop, the soft clack of wheels, the way the kitchen's heat thinned into the corridor like a breath. He was supposed to be invisible. He had been invisible since the day he traded his paramedic badge for a janitor's blue jacket, since the night he had held his wife's hand as the ground shifted under them, and the promises he'd made were reformed into something smaller and more immediate. Invisible had been a choice as much as a consequence. He'd wanted to be there for Emma, wanted to be the steady presence in a world that had been unpredictable. But a father watches. Caregiving taught him how to notice the smallest changes. Emma's breathing taught him to listen. That practice shaped everything else he did. Tonight, as he leaned the mop handle into the corner, a sound threaded through the restaurant's controlled warmth. A child's small cough, muffled and wet. It was easy, in a place like the Celestia, to assume every sound belonged to money and celebration. Rich kids cough, children get colds. But Adam's ear snagged. The cough had a rhythm of its own, a pause that made his jaw go tight. He followed the noise with the patience of someone who had learned to wait out a pulse, who had listened to the chest of a sleeping patient in a van with sirens already on. Through the split in the service door, he saw them. A woman like an image carved from glass and power, Vivian Hale. She moved with that measured authority the wealthy develop, the human equivalent of an automatic door, people stepping aside with practiced deference. She was 38 too, maybe older, whose age could you ever read on someone who'd ordered her years into order, and she had the hair of someone who chose to be seen. Beside her, a boy hunched in his chair like a small island. He was 10, slight, with a pale face that didn't fit in the Celestia's palette. He held one hand over his stomach the way a child guards a bruise. Adam watched them come alive in the doorway and felt the old muscles in his memory wake. Hands reaching for stethoscopes, flashlights, the muscle memory of assessing quickly, of turning a moment into a plan. The boy, Oliver Hale, smiled once at a passing server. The motion practiced, then flinched. His jaw tightened and his shoulders folded inward. He made a noise like someone trying to swallow a wave. Vivian said his name softly, as if the word itself might hold him steady. A man in a tuxedo laughed too loudly at something the room had offered, and the sound fell off the table like sugar, harmless and oblivious. Yet in the hallway where Adam crouched, every clinical detail of the boy's posture spoke to him with the bluntness of a familiar code. A slight fever's flush to the cheeks, the way Oliver pressed his fingertips into his lower right abdomen, the pallor under his eyes. Adam's throat felt dry. He had been a paramedic for a decade, before the nights at Celestia, before bedtimes with Emma became the floor plan of his life. He had carried patients by their names and by their breaths. He had pushed a gurney through the snow and into a hospital bay, and felt the world tighten to the size of the boy's ribs. He had also, once, been unable to save the one he loved more than himself. That knowledge lived like a seam in him, hard, hidden, and always under pressure. He straightened, the mop handle creaking like a small confession. The child's fingers moved again, like a metronome. Adam could see the tiny bead of sweat at the hairline, how the breath came in shallow pulls. He edged closer to the door, not wanting to attract attention. The staff in the dining room were polished, they moved with the ease of certainty. When a parent wants to be seen, the world obliges. Tonight, the world included him too. He stepped out before he could think too much about the manners that separated him from the guests. "Excuse me," he said, voice rough from the night's dust. It was not a question, but it was soft. In the service corridor, being a janitor had taught him how to speak low. Loudness came with privilege, not with the mop. A server glanced toward him with that perfected, dismissive smile that grants permission to continue being unseen. Vivian, however, looked up. A flicker of curiosity, then a guarded politeness. She had the practiced neutral of someone used to people approaching. Her assistant, Diana, leaned forward, fingers on a phone. Even the boy's small features aligned into a guarded shape. Oliver watched him through the corner of his eye, as if evaluating whether the intrusion was another threat. "My name is Adam," he said. "I work here. I used to be a paramedic." A pause. Vivian's eyebrows climbed in the subtle question of someone who measured information for later use. "I know this place," she said.
"Many people claim backgrounds." "No claim," Adam said. "I checked in with security at the desk. I don't want to alarm anyone, but that boy looks like he might have appendicitis." For a second, the hallway swallowed the words. The claim itself was simple. A room full of people heard appendicitis, and it took different shapes. A hazard, a rumor, an interruption. For Adam, the word arrived in his mouth weighed with facts. The boy's timeline, the tender point just right of the belly button, the way his face folded when he tried the laugh. He could have made hypotheses that wouldn't stick, but instincts had their language. He had learned to trust that language because people depended on it. He leaned closer when Oliver turned his face, the child's patience threadbare. "How long?" he asked, in the manner of someone who knew how to gather a chain of events without wringing it into hysteria. "Since noon, maybe," Vivian said. She was precise. "He had some stomach pain after lunch. Fever came on this evening. The pediatrician said it might be a virus, gave him something for nausea. We watched him. He seemed better." "Did he have a fever this afternoon?" Adam asked. "Low grade," Vivian answered. "Not high. Nothing dramatic." "Any vomiting? No appetite?" Adam's questions were quick, clinical fingers feeling for the sequence that would separate indigestion from emergency. Oliver's lips flinched. His hand tightened on his side. "A little vomiting early," Vivian said. "He didn't want to eat, but he rested. I told the doctor we could keep an eye on him. I had to get back for a meeting." Adam's chest tightened with the echo of his own choices. Leaving the ambulance because his daughter needed an outpatient appointment that couldn't wait, putting family first and watching his career recede. He remembered nights of shift coffee and breathless calls, of listening to monitors with his hand pressed to strangers' foreheads. He also remembered the last time he'd ignored his gut. That memory had the sound of a hospital elevator, the light too bright, the smell of antiseptic, and the passenger seat empty at dawn. "May I?" he started. He knew there were boundaries, workplaces run on them. He also knew that not speaking had undone a lot of things in his life. Vivian glanced at Oliver. The boy's face had begun to crease in a way that made Adam's own heart hit a missing beat. "He's tired," Vivian said. "He's on antibiotics." "Antibiotics won't stop a ruptured appendix," Adam interrupted, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of someone whose speech had been trained by seasons of urgency. "They can help with infection, but if it ruptures, it's a different crisis. The pattern he's describing and where he keeps pressing, if he has rebound tenderness at McBurney's point, that can mean his appendix is inflamed and close to perforation. When did the pain move to the lower right?" "Late afternoon," Oliver said, voice thin.
Adam's fingers hovered over the boy's shoulder like a promise. He would touch with the carefulness of someone who had learned to make contact in moments that might be the difference. He placed his hand lightly by Oliver's waist. The child flinched. The tenderness signaled under his palm. It was not diagnostic in the way a CT scan is, but it was aligned with the pattern he'd seen dozens of times. "Sir," Pierre, the Celestia manager, called from deeper in the corridor, his voice practiced to smooth any rising dissonance. "Is everything?" "Fine," Adam said softly, to avoid the loudness. He did not want to embarrass Vivian, who could have become defensive in the face of a stranger's bluntness. He also did not want to delay. Vivian's jaw tightened, the expression of someone protecting the arrangement of her day. "We have a pediatrician on call. We've already called," she began, as if reciting the ritual that gentility provides in emergencies. "That's good," Adam allowed. "Call them again and tell them the timeline. Tell them the pain moved to the lower right. Ask for a priority assessment. If there's rebound, if he cusses when you let go of the pressure, that's a red flag. If the fever's rising and his heart rate is elevated, he needs an immediate transfer." Silence, then like a held breath. Diana's hand hovered over her phone. The servers had their practiced smiles that hid their curiosity. Some watched with the distance of those who are not meant to intervene. The restaurant chandeliers spilled indifferent light over the scene, gilding the edges of small human panic. Vivian met Adam's eyes. "Do you work with children?" she asked. "No," he said truthfully. "Mostly adults when I was paramedic. But appendicitis is appendicitis. Patterns are patterns. It can change fast." Her gaze softened for the first time, an almost human recognition threading through her careful control. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He thought of Emma asleep at home, the rain tapping the window above her bed, the way he used to trace the scars on his wife's hand and feel them as a geography. He thought of the nights he had held people at their worst, and the way a small observation could reroute a life. He thought of the cost of silence. "Because if I'm wrong, nothing changes," he said. "If I'm right, it could matter." She swallowed. It was a phrase she might have used in a boardroom, but she said it now as a mother, with an urgency that did not care about titles. Pierre stepped closer, unsure whether to enforce the decorum of the restaurant or concede to the truth in Adam's words. Diana's fingers trembled over her phone. "We're sending a car to the hospital," she said, attempting authority. "Ambulance," Adam said, flat and simple. "If it's appendicitis and you're trying to get to the ER in bad traffic, the ambulance gets them there faster and with a paramedic who can monitor him on the way. It also gets the ER pre-alerted so they can prepare." Vivian's eyes flashed, not with defiance, but with the calculation of someone balancing control, cost, and fear. "An ambulance will be seen as an overreaction," she said. "People will see it. The media." "Will you risk a child's life to avoid a drive-by commentary?" Adam asked. The words were sharper than he'd intended, but sometimes truth needs a clean edge. Oliver made a small noise. The room's noise huddled around him like a blanket that wouldn't quite warm. Vivian's hand trembled, the way anyone's does when the armor shifts. "Call the ambulance," she said finally. Her voice was a fuse lit by fear. "Do it now." Pierre moved, smooth and trained. Diana made the call, breath steadying, the digital rhythm of the phone sound like a tiny relay saving something larger. The first instruction into the receiver was crisp. Name, location, child's age, suspected appendicitis. Adam watched the exchange, watching his past unfold into its present possibility. He felt the old rush of being useful, of lines of connection forming from him to people in white who could cut and sew and save. A part of him bristled at being noticed, another part drank the heat of responsibility. There was a memory of his wife, Sarah, leaning against the kitchen counter at 2 a.m, telling him to stop taking on the world's pain alone, and he had smiled and promised. Promises had a way of changing shape. He had promised Emma everything he could hold inside his 2 hands. "Will you come with us?" Vivian asked, suddenly tentative. Adam looked at the boy again.
He saw the pain contort, not the theatrical writhe of someone seeking attention, but the small, honest collapse of a child whose belly had betrayed him. He swallowed a memory of a hospital hallway where his own hands had been empty, and answered without thought. "I'll come to the ambulance ride if you want," he said. "I can call a former colleague. Dr. Martinez still works across town. She's good. I can call her on the way." Vivian's face was a study of unaccustomed humility. "Who are you?" she asked, not rudely, just as a reconnection. It was a recognition of an unfamiliar variable. "Adam Cooper," he said. "I sweep after you. I also want to help." There was a moment then when the corridor felt too small for the choices being made in it. A server reached out to steady a plate on the service cart, as if to anchor the ordinary while emergency made its way in. Mrs. Rosa, the neighbor who sometimes babysat Emma and waved at Adam when he walked his daughter to school, happened to be there dropping off a bouquet for a private table. She stopped, hands clasped at her chest, the living emblem of neighborhood constancy. She looked at Vivian with the straightforward compassion of someone who'd seen the hard edges of life up close. "You do the ambulance," she said, like an instruction. "No messing. Child first." Vivian's jaw flexed. People who built empires built themselves on the illusion that mercy could be budgeted. Tonight, that illusion cracked. The ambulance call rippled out. Within minutes that Adam measured by the metronome of his breathing, security whispered a report back. An EMT team was en route. Estimated arrival time, 7 minutes. 7 minutes was a small number with a very large echo. Oliver's breathing became shallower. He tried to smile at a waiter who attempted a joke and failed. Vivian stood at his side like a tower of glass, fingers white around his knuckles. She was the person people perceived as invulnerable, and, in the privacy of a corridor, she was simply a mother, raw and exposed. "What's your daughter's condition?" Vivian asked, voice steady now, curious in that human way the powerful are sometimes when they want to know how someone else navigates the world. Emma's name drew Adam back to the other shore of his life. He pictured her asleep in their small apartment, her hair in loose braids, a band of adhesive across her chest where she wore a monitor on sleep nights. Emma had a congenital heart condition, mild, managed, but it had reframed their decisions into a pattern of extra caution. At night, while the city burned bright, he lived with a farmer's watchfulness, checking that the small chest rose and fell. He'd taken safety over salary because nothing could replace the sound of his daughter's breath. "Emma has a mitral valve repair on the registry," he said, not wanting to overshare or seem like he was competing with the moment. "She needs more observation than most kids her age. That's why I don't work nights in the old way anymore. I can't be away." Vivian's expression softened in a way that no corporate speech could manufacture. It was the look of someone recognizing kinship despite a gulf of resources. Several people have wealth and find themselves impoverished of something: time, certainty, a hand to hold. The corridor stitched itself into an unlikely commune. "That's a heavy weight," Vivian said. "You chose to carry it." "Didn't feel like a choice some nights," Adam admitted. "Felt like the only thing that let me sleep." "You're brave," she said, too quick, as if she had to claim the right to say it. He knew she was trying to stand in a territory of human feeling where many of her equals felt clumsy. "You saved him by—" She stopped, because the word save was too big, and because pride and necessity warred in her. "We haven't saved anything yet," he corrected gently. "We have time. We have to use it." Her laugh was a small, incredulous thing. "You're very calm for a man who tells a billionaire to call an ambulance." "Calm is old practice," Adam said, "and sometimes adrenaline does half the talking for me." She reached for Oliver's hand, the gesture simple and unadorned. "Thank you," she said, "for noticing." "Thank you for listening," he replied. The siren was a thread under the city's noise, a sound that reorganized the edges of the night as it got closer. Security opened a door. The restaurant staff parted with rehearsed efficiency. Pierre offered his arm to Vivian as though chaperoning a moment of personal crisis. The ambulance pulled up with a brushed metal slowness that belied the urgency inside it. 2 EMTs hopped out, professional and practiced, their faces masks of careful assessment. One of them, young, freckled, checked his tablet and nodded to his partner. Adam stepped back as they approached, hands shoved into his jacket, the old paramedic instinct not wholly back but hovering like a shadow. He watched the paramedics with the same scrutiny he used to reserve for monitors and patients' pupils. The screen of the tablet flashed vitals when they took Oliver's temperature and pulse, the numbers small and precise. The EMT asked the routine questions and then fell into the rhythm of hands-on assessment. "Where's the pain now?" the lead EMT asked, more to the boy than to the adults. Oliver tried to point, and his finger landed near the lower right. His face went hard. The EMT's jaw tightened. "We'll get you on a stretcher and take you to the hospital," he said, all bedside manner and certainty. "Any other medical history?" Vivian recited the pediatrician's name in a low, controlled voice. The EMT made notes, eyes briefly meeting Adam's as if measuring the noise he had brought into the room. The exchange was practical and efficient, words like transfer, pre-alert, pediatric surgical consult. Adam felt the old language slide back into place, the kind that had warmed his hands before. "Do you want me to go with you?" he asked Oliver, before he had time to consider whether it was his place. Oliver shrugged, a small truth. He wanted to get out of the pressure and the luminous eyes. He wanted a bed that smelled like medicine instead of candles. He wanted to be held without performance. Vivian hesitated, weighing status against fear. "If you can," she said at last, the sentence both an entrance and an admission. Adam nodded. The lift to the ambulance felt like a descent into something more honest than the gilded dining room they'd left. Lights on the strip slurred past as the ambulance moved, the city giving itself in flickers. Inside, the EMTs prepared an oxygen mask, secured the IV line. The vehicle jolted over wet asphalt, and the siren wove through traffic like a blade seeking the seam. Adam kept his hands to himself, maybe out of politeness, maybe because he wanted to preserve the boy's personal space. He remembered the smell of antiseptic, and the way hospitals felt like temporary weather systems, climates you had to navigate with care. When they arrived, the ER was already bright with efficient action. The front desk clerk took the pre-alert seriously, and the triage nurse smiled with the practiced empathy of someone who'd seen each kind of human crisis multiple times. By the time they reached triage, Adam felt the old muscle memory stuttering back, gauging, asking, listening. He repeated the timeline once more: lunchtime pain, afternoon progression, fever. The triage nurse placed a thermometer and then a stethoscope. A rapid evaluation took form. Vitals, a brief abdominal exam, the point of concern highlighted in the map of Oliver's belly. An urgent call went out to pediatrics, surgical consult requested for suspected appendicitis. In a dim corner of his mind, Adam counted like a man who used to count the seconds between breaths. In this case, the count meant the time the appendix might take to go from inflamed to ruptured, the cascade of potential complications that a perforation could bring. He had seen the worst of it once. He could not make that memory dictate tonight. Dr. Rachel Martinez arrived like someone who had been called in before the phrase "on call" had time to chill. She was a woman who had been Adam's colleague once. They'd run calls together, swapped coffee and complaints in an ambulance that smelled always like a hospital. She recognized the tilt of her head, the way she opened her medical bag, the economy of her gestures. Their eyes met. There was a recognition there that had nothing to do with uniforms and everything to do with shared history. "Hey," Adam said when she had a moment, the corridor between them a tight channel. "Rachel." "Adam." Her face softened. "I remember you. You did that wreck off the freeway years ago." "It wasn't me alone," he said reflexively. "You and I both were there." She gave a small, wry smile, and then turned toward Oliver with the efficiency that defined her. "How long has the pain been moving?" she asked, as much to the boy as to Vivian. Adam repeated the timeline. Dr. Martinez listened with clinical concentration that did not erase warmth. She pressed gently at the boy's belly, watching the child's face register the pressure. Adam's heart thudded with the cadence of observation, not yet claim. "Let's get an ultrasound and a CT if needed," she said into her radio, voice dispatching the plan into motion. "Prep OR in case this is a perforated appendix. Notify pediatric surgery." Dr. Patel walked in shortly after, his presence a steadying force, the on-call surgeon, older and measured. He exchanged the technical nods with Dr. Martinez and then turned to Vivian and Adam, addressing them both with a professional clarity. "We need to get him into surgery if the appendicitis is confirmed," he said. "If the appendix has ruptured, it becomes more complicated, but still operable. The key is rapid assessment and timely operative management." Adam caught every word and held it between his ribs like a compass. He could have taken the moment as validation, or he could let it dissolve into the background of 1,000 other emergencies. He was tired of the invisible man who wasn't validated until white coats confirmed him. But tonight was not about ego. Most of all, he thought of vigilance, how it shaped a life into a poem of micro-attentions. It made one small person notice and perhaps remake the shape of another's fate. Hours in a waiting room move on their own geometry. Sometimes they stretch into elastic bands. Sometimes they compress into a fist. Adam counted the minutes in small units, phone calls to Dr. Martinez, reassurances half said. He called Mrs. Rosa to ask if she could check on Emma. Mrs. Rosa's voice over the phone was steady and kind. He told her not to worry, but his own words had none of the certainties he wanted to offer. Vivian remained near the glass that looked into the OR corridor. She watched surgical doors like someone watching the stage of a theater, her posture telling all the stories that money could not rewrite. When the surgeon emerged at last, the expression on his face was the exact professional code Adam had once respected. Businesslike, not exuberant, but bearing a slant of relief. He crossed the sterile floor toward them. "How is he?" Vivian asked, the sound of a question that had been living in her chest like an injury. "Appendix was inflamed, localized," Dr. Patel said. "We got it out before any rupture. He responded well under anesthesia. We'll move him to pediatrics for observation and post-op care. Expect a few days in hospital. Small risk of infection, but we'll manage it with antibiotics and monitoring." Vivian let the information land like a stone in a pond, the ripples of reaction moving outward. She swayed a little, as if gravity had come back to claim part of her. She looked at Adam, and for once, the gulf between them narrowed into an island of mutual relief. "You were right," she said, the sentence carrying the kind of weight money couldn't buy. Adam's hands were suddenly a map of all the small movements he had made that night. The mop lever, the heat of the bucket, the embrace of a child's shoulder. "We were," he said. He didn't want to take a credit that might feel like vanity. He had felt the rightness of a decision be both small and enormous. A brushstroke that changed a painting's direction. She reached into her bag and handed him a card. Not a check, not an envelope, but a card with a name and an offer veiled in discretion. "I want to talk tomorrow," she said. "About what you do. About, well, I think there's more to this." Adam accepted the card like a strange coin. The offer hummed in the air between practical relief and something that might open a door. He had left one life of white coats to enter a world where his hands cleaned after it. The idea of stepping back toward his old skills in a sanctioned way without the penalizing demands of an EMS schedule seemed both improbable and necessary. But the night was not yet wholly done. As Oliver slept in a pediatric bed, breathing steadier with each monitored rise and fall, other things hummed at the edge of the moment, the way a child's life could tilt a household, the way recognition could reframe a man who had been taught to be unseen. The hospital lights went on with their cool honesty. The city hummed beyond, indifferent and bright. Adam left the room for a breath of air, and the hospital corridor wrapped around him like a familiar coat. He looked at the card in his hand, the name of one of the city's most reclusive philanthropists printed in careful type. He pressed it, folding the corner between his fingers until the paper softened.
For a man whose life had been arranged around the straight lines of responsibility, this was a pivot point. He dialed home with a thumb that trembled, not with fear so much as the outrage of relief. Emma's voice on the other end was sleepy and bright. Mrs. Rosa hummed in the background like a comfort radio. He told Emma in pieces, small syllables that were more prayer than report. "He's okay. It's all right. Dinner." He promised to be home as soon as he could, though he knew the hospital might ask him to stay if Vivian was to return with an offer. Promises had shifted in scale in his life. Small pledges acquired the weight of oaths. He folded the card into his wallet and let it lay next to the badge stub of an old paramedic ID, both artifacts, both anchors. The night had done something it had not intended. It had placed him where his old life and his current one intersected like two rivers meeting, and the water there was surprisingly clear. Outside, the strip kept moving. People who would never look down into the back corridor of a restaurant, who would never see the hands that cleaned their crumbs from their plates, flowed in and out of the city's bright teeth. Inside, a janitor had shifted, in the most human of ways, into someone who had been listened to, who had, for a brief and terrifying span, insisted. There would be consequences, conversations, and choices. There would be a morning when Vivian's world would offer him something that might change the shape of his work, and there would be the quieter morning at his apartment when Emma would ask a question he could not entirely answer. For now, though, the night had allowed him a strange and small victory, the knowledge that staying awake, paying attention, and speaking up had rearranged at least one life. He washed his hands in the bathroom sink, the water scouring the night's grime, and the noise of the faucet sounded like applause in his ears, a small, private celebration. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done what he thought was needed. If stories like this move you, subscribe to see more. The card in his wallet sat heavy as he walked back through the hospital doors. He had not come for reputation. He had come because a boy had been in pain and someone needed to notice. Even as the adrenaline faded and the lights of the strip dimmed into the east, his mind was already cataloging small domestic things. Emma's bedtime story tonight, the spare change he would find between couch cushions to pay for a copay, the promise he would make to himself to be better at answering both life's alarms and her nighttime questions. Later, when the first wave of journalists' inquiries drowned around the edges of the hospital, someone always reported high-profile emergencies, he would choose what to say. He would not be tempted into grand statements. He had learned, painfully, that the most important truths were quiet, and that dignity often lived in the small spaces between people who cared. What he could not foresee, sitting in that vinyl chair with the plastic of the armrest indenting his skin, was how that single insistence, one man choosing to speak up in a corridor that had insisted upon silence, would ripple outward. There were whispers already about a meeting the next morning, about a foundation, about opportunities that would require him to choose again between being there for Emma and stepping back into medicine. The job in his hand tonight, mopping, sweeping, wiping, felt both more and less than the life he'd once imagined. It was a job that demanded vigilance, and it had rewarded him with a moment that tasted, in an odd way, like redemption. He stayed until the surgeon's report had been finalized, and until a nurse assured Vivian that Oliver would be safe through the night. Only then did he leave, slipping out into the cold of the early dawn with a thrumming steadiness in his chest. The city was quiet, the strip's glow bleached to a soft haze. He walked past the valet folding sleeping suits like tired shapes. The gas station 2 blocks from his building sputtered neon above its slumped door. He pressed the card into his pocket and thought of the tiny, deliberate acts of attention that had made the difference this night. At home, Emma curled into him on the couch, her hair smelling faintly of cherry toothpaste. She was a living argument against the world, tiny and absolute, and he kissed the top of her head and promised to stay. He unzipped his jacket and pulled off his shoes, the day's dirt a history on the soles. He picked up her favorite stuffed bear and tucked it under her arm like the small chaplain he had become. Outside their window, the city receded into a blue-gray hush. He set the card on the kitchen table and looked at the small cluster of bills he kept in a jar for medical copays. The choices ahead were not simple. They would require him to make trades and to measure the weight of an offer in a way he'd never had to before. He had thought the most expensive thing he'd ever deal with was time. Now he saw there were other prices too, the currency of proximity, the cost of stepping into work that might remove him from Emma's every small breath. He turned off the kitchen light and watched Emma breathe.
He counted her breaths until sleep took her completely, and then he sat with the quiet he had earned as a person who had been given back something fragile. He did not need accolades. He had found, under the fluorescent hum of a hospital night and the glittering indifference of a restaurant, a geometry of meaning. Paying attention could save people. Speaking up could save lives. When sleep finally caught him, it was not the exhausted collapse he'd felt on some nights. It was a cautious, watchful rest, like someone closing their eyes mid-guard. The city outside carried on with its shallow, dazzling claims. The man inside the small apartment held his daughter's hand as if it were a talisman. The card in his jacket was the night's artifact, a small, flat thing with a name on it. It felt like a hinge. Morning would come with decisions. It would require courage of a different temper, the courage to accept help without losing the line to what mattered most. But for now, the child who had nearly been lost had not been lost, and Adam had acted in the ordinary, unglamorous way he knew best. He noticed, he spoke, and he stayed. He was supposed to be invisible. Instead, he had become something that could not be worn away by a polish cloth or the glare of a chandelier. A presence that mattered in the hard way that mattered most. The night breathed out, and the strip held its light while a janitor walked toward a future no longer quite alike to the one he'd planned. Morning arrived like an apology. Soft, pale light spilling through blinds, the city trading its neon for a quieter tone. Adam woke before the alarm, the cards still folded in his wallet like a secret hinge. He replayed the night again in the small theater of his mind. Oliver's face, the hush of the OR doors, Vivian's hand on his. The memory settled into him with the same stubborn, steady weight that parenting had taught him to carry. Mrs. Rosa knocked on his door before he left, basket of empanadas in hand and a knowing look in her eyes. "You're going to meet with the lady?" she asked, as if that question could be answered with anything but a nod and a cup of coffee. He laughed, a short thing that relieved the tightness in his chest. "Yeah, guess I am." "You keep your eyes on what you need to keep," she said, sliding a pastry into a paper bag. "Don't let anyone make you feel small about what you do." Small. Adam considered the word as he dressed. He straightened the collar of an old shirt, smoothed down the jacket, whose sleeves remembered many scrub sinks and mop buckets. He wasn't used to suits, or to the idea that someone like Vivian, someone with money and staff and names of buildings attached to her, would want to speak with him about more than gratitude. Yet when he looked at Emma sleeping, mouth slack against the stuffed bear, the choice felt clearer. Whatever came, it had to keep her safe. The Hale building was glass and gravity. Security recognized Vivian's name with a quiet choreography. Visitors were given polite forms and an efficient cup of breathing room. Adam signed in like a man stepping into another life for a few hours. Visitor, not intruder. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and a brand that insisted on sterile perfection. He felt his own hands, calloused and honest, press against the paper of his visitor badge. Diana met him in a small conference room that smelled of coffee and new carpet. She had a gentleness now that softened the managerial precision they'd displayed the night before. "We're keeping this small," she said, sliding a glass of water across. Vivian wanted to speak privately. When Vivian entered, she wore the same quiet command as always, but there was an absence of armor that made her look human in a way the marble could never make plain. She shook his hand with the same firm pressure she used to set negotiations. "Adam," she said, "thank you for coming."
He set his jaw against nerves and answered the way he always did when something important needed saying. Simply, "Thank you for calling." They sat. Papers were on the table, but mostly what was between them was a conversation that had already been started in a corridor the night before. Vivian opened it without preamble. "I don't usually operate this personally," she said, "but you saved my son last night. You insisted on an ambulance. You asked the questions no one else did. That moved him from risk into care." Adam felt the shape of gratitude in her voice and a curiosity under it, something like an offer being tested for fit. "I didn't save him," he said. "I just noticed. The rest, doctors, surgery, that's what saved him." "Not entirely," she said. "You were the one who chose to speak up. That matters. It matters a lot." There was a silence in which Adam considered the politics of the room, the people who shaped decisions and how they did it. He had no desire to be paraded in the press or to be a mounted symbol of an evening gone right. What he wanted was practical, a way to keep Emma safe and a job that could let him be both present for his daughter and useful in the field he had been trained for. Vivian seemed to have guessed the direction of his thought. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," she said, "but we are building an employee health program for Hale Technologies. We're opening a clinic on our campus, primary care, some urgent services, and coordination with nearby hospitals. I want you to help design it, not as charity, but as a practical role, medical liaison and community coordinator, a job with a salary, benefits, and hands-on influence." It was the kind of sentence that rearranged furniture in a life. Adam pictured fluorescent clinic lights rather than chandeliers, charts rather than menus. The practicalities bubbled in his chest. Would it mean more time away from Emma or less? Would it require credentials he no longer had? He asked those things straight away. "What do you see me doing?" he asked. Vivian smiled, the expression of someone who'd thought about risk and reward and had chosen a path that combined both. "You'll coordinate care for employees and their families, build a rapid response protocol for our campus events, train staff, especially those who are frequently around guests and employees, to notice and report medical concerns early. We also want someone who understands the emotional architecture of crisis because it affects how people act. You impressed us with that last night." A part of him hesitated at the language, impressed, like a label being applied to a skin he had grown into. He saw, too, that this was not only about a clinic. It was a chance to make a structural change, training cleaning staff and service workers to be part of an early warning system, making sure janitorial and hospitality workers had a pathway to report and be heard. "And the hours?" he asked, "because I have to be available for Emma." Vivian's eyes softened. "We will make accommodations. We want this to work for you and for your family. Full health coverage for Emma, paid time off for important appointments, and a flexible schedule so you can be present. This is not charity. It's an employment offer. We don't want to take your choice away, only to support it." He thought of the copay jar on his kitchen table, of nights sleeping with 1 year open for Emma's monitor. He thought of the paramedic badge tucked beside the card in his wallet. He thought of the frozen dinners he bought on half-off nights and of bills that arrived like demands. When he spoke, his voice was steady but small with the size of the decision. "I don't want pity. I want to work. If this is an actual job with real responsibilities and not a PR stunt, then I'm interested. But I won't be a figurehead. I want to do the job right." Vivian inclined her head. "Do the job right," she repeated. "That's exactly why I wanted you. If you're willing, we'll draw up an offer. We can make sure Dr. Martinez is involved in the clinical side. She'll be our liaison to the hospital network. We'll pay competitively, and we'll set the hours you need." He thought of Dr. Martinez's face in the ER, recognition and steadiness, and felt a relief that he wouldn't be moving into this alone. He accepted, on the condition that the schedule be negotiated so Emma's nighttime monitoring and appointments could be prioritized. Vivian agreed. They stood to shake hands. The exchange felt like a contract written in small gestures rather than signatures. As he left the building, the sun was higher and the air warmer, and he felt it, A recalibration. Not a rescue, not a sudden elevation. The offer was practical and, for him, profound. Back at the apartment, Mrs. Rosa celebrated with extra coffee and an earnest sermon about how some people are given opportunities and some are given the courage to say yes.
Emma listened, eyes wide and full of a happiness that had 1,000 tiny wings in it. "Are you going to fix hearts now, Daddy?" she asked, earnest and literal. "Helping keep people from getting hurt," he said, and the simplicity of his answer pleased her. "And helping grown-ups get to the clinic when they need it." She nodded solemnly, as if this explained everything. She held his hand much longer than usual when he left for his first day of orientation at the Hale campus. Orientation was a soft landing, an HR tour, a badge, an ID photo that made him look more official than he felt. He met Dr. Rachel Martinez again in a small office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon. She clasped his hand in the professional way colleagues do when there is both history and mutual respect at stake. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "Last night you did the right thing. I'm glad we have a chance to get you back into some kind of medical rhythm." He told her about the choices that had taken him away from regular shifts, Emma's needs, the fear of being away when she needed him. She listened, the lines at her eyes softening with a recognition that had less to do with hospital hierarchy than with what life asks of people. "We'll make it work," she promised. "We need people who notice. Not every system anticipates that." In the weeks that followed, his life rearranged into a new kind of mosaic. He learned the clinic's scheduling software, the names of the nurses and receptionists, and the logistics of pre-authorizations. He led training sessions with housekeeping and security staff, people who had been taught to make themselves small. He taught them how to be big in the ways that mattered, how to ask specific, short questions, how to check for a fever or a change in behavior, where to find the first aid kit, how to communicate in a way that a provider could act on. He wrote a short checklist for staff, clear, simple, non-intimidating, and used the same patient voice he'd used in a corridor to get people to pay attention. There were small irritations, corporate forms that preferred box checks to nuance, staff who had been burned by managers who imagined empathy as a risk, and a few board members who wondered aloud whether the clinic should be run more traditionally. Vivian handled that with a corporate patience that hid fierce conviction. "This is not a charity experiment," she told the board in a narrow conference room. "This is an investment in the people who make this company run. If we lose day shift cleaners to avoidable illness or don't catch a child's worsening symptoms until it's a crisis, we lose far more than money." She named the program the Cooper Initiative in internal materials at first, then softened it to the Cooper Foundation as their charitable arm. A fund to support single parents and healthcare careers, emergency medical grants for families, and a training program that gave hospitality workers access to medical observation training and certified first responder courses. She insisted on the name because she wanted to honor the person who had reminded her of the human cost of invisibility. Adam did not want a foundation named after him. He was wary of being turned into a symbol. But he accepted the practicalities when Vivian insisted that the fund be guided by those who had lived the work. His workdays became an odd, braided thing, part administrator, part trainer, part de facto on-call presence at campus events. He wrote protocols for when to escalate from internal transport to an ambulance, how to pre-alert the nearest children's hospital, and how to ensure parents like Vivian and custodial workers like his colleagues were both heard. He had a small office that faced a courtyard, where cacti caught the sunlight and the echoes of the strip seemed both far and irrelevant. He made a point of walking down to the loading dock sometimes, trading jokes and small confidences with the maintenance crew who had been his peers at Celestia. He remembered where he had come from in every handshake. There were days he missed a familiar rhythm, the adrenaline of the unknown, the sense of bodily competence he enjoyed in emergency calls. But there were also days when a parent would stop him in the hallway to say simply, "Thank you," because their child had been triaged sooner thanks to a prompt staff member. Those small acknowledgments fed him in ways he hadn't known he was hungry. Oliver's recovery became a slow, sturdy story. He convalesced home and then at the pediatric wing for a few days. He learned how the body patches of medicine fit together: antibiotics, diet, rest. Vivian visited him like a minister of both regret and relief, and she called Adam with updates in the early weeks, her voice less brittle than the first nights. She invited Adam and Emma to a low-key thank you tea at her private terrace, where Emma and Oliver sat across from one another at a small table, and within minutes began plotting the construction of a Lego hospital that looked suspiciously like their own patched-together domestic world. They were 10 and 6 in spirit, and their alliance felt like an unplanned piece of diplomacy. Adam kept coming to Celestia sometimes, not because he needed the income, but because the people there had been his anchor. Pierre joined one of his first training sessions, nodding with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. The man admitted later that night that he had never thought to ask a janitor about anything medical before last month. "I assumed you just cleaned," Pierre confessed. "I didn't see you as someone whose voice mattered."
People's voices often get missed, Adam said. That's what I'm trying to change. Adam's acceptance of the role had consequences beyond a paycheck. The Cooper Foundation launched with an online portal that took applicants for emergency grants, single parents who needed coverage for urgent surgeries, young people who wanted EMT certification but couldn't afford tuition, hospitality workers seeking flexible training schedules. Vivian worked the press carefully at first. She insisted the foundation not be a billboard for her philanthropy, but a practical, accountable arm that measured its success in lives stabilized rather than headlines won. At the foundation's first board meeting, a woman who had spent a lifetime building nonprofit resumes asked bluntly whether the program could scale or whether it would fade. "We can't sustain small miracles if they aren't embedded in systems," she said. Vivian agreed and pivoted the plan toward partnerships with hospitals, training schools, and local unions. Adam was on the advisory council, not as a token, but as someone who had walked in both work boots and scrubs. He pushed for funds to be attached to childcare options for parents in on-call medical programs, arguing with quiet force that single parents needed the scaffolding that allowed them to do the very jobs eager institutions claimed to value. His life at home found its new rhythm, too. Emma's appointments were covered in a way that reduced the accounts jar on his table. Copays became manageable, and for the first time in years, he did not have to argue with a receptionist about refund timing. He could leave the building sometimes to catch the last 15 minutes of her school performances. He and Mrs. Rosa developed a schedule where the neighbor could pop in when he had an early morning meeting. He slept with less of an edge and more of a watchful acceptance. There were, of course, awkward moments. When press came for the foundation's opening, a reporter wanted the narrative of uplift. The janitor becomes hero, billionaire rewards saintly worker, child saved. Adam deflected interviews with a quiet, almost stubborn modesty. He didn't want to be painted as a moral exemplar that erased the structural inequalities that had forced him into janitorial work despite his training. He wanted the conversation to stay on policy. How do we make systems where those who notice are heard, where early interventions are possible, and where single parents aren't choosing between work and their children's safety? One afternoon, a camera crew followed him into a training. He stood before a group of cleaning staff, some in their 20s, others older, all bearing the quiet dignity of manual labor. He demonstrated how to check a child's abdomen for a particular tenderness without causing alarm, how to call for help without apologizing for doing so. The cameras caught his hands, scarred, patient, capable, and the footage later aired with muted fanfare. The clip ended with Vivian at his side, not dominating the frame, but visible as an instigator of change rather than a savior. There were private rewards that mattered more to him than any publicity. Oliver and Emma became regular playmates. On a slow Sunday, the two kids were building a fort out of cushions in Adam's living room when Oliver announced, with solemn certainty, that when he grew up, he wanted to help people, like doctors. Emma declared she would build a heart house because hearts needed protection, and Lego did not judge. They made one another lunch and traded stickers with the kind of serious bargaining that passes for diplomacy at that age. Watching them, Adam felt the raw satisfaction that came from watching two small lives be neither tragedy nor trophy, but simply neighbors. Dr. Martinez remained a steady ally. One evening, as Adam walked her to her car after a late clinic review, she turned to him with a frankness that had always marked their exchanges. "You did more than point out a diagnosis," she said. "You rewrote a script, and you did it without needing a medal. That, in a way, is more important." He shrugged, the gesture modest. "I just noticed what needed noticing." She smiled, almost warm. "And then you made sure someone acted on it. That's what leaders do, sometimes quietly." He thought of Sarah in that moment, how the small choices they had made once had pushed him into the janitor's jacket to keep a promise. He pictured her laugh in the old kitchen and felt both the hollow left by loss and the steady fill of a life repaired by careful decisions. There was grief and there was love, and both were part of the fabric he was living. The Cooper Foundation started to make small ripples. A single mother who worked nights at a casino received a grant that allowed her to afford extra monitoring for her asthmatic son. A maintenance worker received an EMT scholarship and later took a position as a health aide at the Hale Clinic. The foundation's metrics were modest but real: fewer delayed ER visits for employees and a handful of people reporting that the training had made them feel safer at work. Adam's own relationship with visibility shifted slowly. He still favored humility. Recognition made him uncomfortable in ways he'd never learned to perform. But he learned to accept that attention could be useful. He began to mentor a young man named Marco, who worked nights in the Marriott's laundry and had once imagined becoming a nurse but couldn't find the funds. Adam guided him through application forms, offered practice interviews, and walked with him to the community college one evening to point out where the EMT course started. Watching someone else take a step forward because of a small nudge felt like the most honest reward. Not everything smoothed. There were nights Emma demanded he be home, and days the clinic had an event that required his presence. Negotiations were ongoing, a constant recalibration of work, care, and love. Sometimes he failed. Once he missed a school assembly because he had been called into an urgent string of employee visits. When he returned home that night, Emma was quiet for a long time before she climbed into his lap and said, "Did you forget me?" He hurt in the place where all parents' guilt lives. "No," he said, "I just had to help people. I'm sorry." She accepted the answer in her own small, sturdy way. "Okay," she said, "but tomorrow, can you be in the front row?" He promised and kept that promise like a vow. They made rituals that made the gaps less severe. A silly handshake in the morning, a note in her lunchbox on days he worked late, a bedtime story over FaceTime when he was traveling for a conference. Vivian's world shifted too. Watching the foundation succeed in small, measurable ways, she grew less interested in gesture and more in structure. How to create policies that gave people choices. The board of Hale Technologies saw that the foundation had reputational benefits, sure, but more importantly, it reduced turnover and improved morale. The business case, Vivian learned to say in meetings, was not in philanthropy's warm glow, but in the simple arithmetic that healthy, supported employees cost less in crisis. At a small ribbon cutting for the clinic's community outreach space, Vivian invited Adam to speak. He declined several times, the discomfort of public applause making his hands clench. At the third insistence, he agreed to say a few words, not for crowds, but because the program had become a scaffold he believed in. He spoke without flourish. He spoke about noticing, about the dignity of work that keeps other people's nights orderly and clean, about the tiny acts of attention that kept families whole. He refused the romantic language of heroism. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I was a man who saw something and asked for help. The real heroes are the people who operate when things are quiet. Our nurses, our cleaners, our neighbors. The change is when we pay attention to one another before it's an emergency." The crowd, employees, board members, local press, and a sprinkling of neighbors, listened in a way that made Adam feel seen but not spotlighted. Afterwards, people came forward with stories of small rescues they had been told to ignore at work, and Adam listened with the same patience he'd taught others to use. 6 months after the night that rearranged his life, there was an ordinary Sunday that felt unusually full of small wonders. The kids were at a park with scraped knees and sticky hands. Vivian, more relaxed than he had known her, brought cold water in a thermos and ate fries with an ease that had once been unthinkable in public. They watched Oliver and Emma launch a paper airplane into a wind that felt like mercy. An email came through his phone while he sat on a bench, the subject line a quiet piece of bureaucracy. A new cohort of hospitality staff was set to begin training, and they'd asked for him to be the lead. He read it and smiled. It was work that fit him like a glove. On the walk home, he thought of the night he had been invisible in the Celestia corridor and how one insistence had made a difference. The image surprised him with its simplicity, a mop handle leaning in the corner and a boy clutching his side. He had acted, not because he sought fame, but because someone had been in pain and he had been able to see it. There were still decisions to make, offers to consider, the occasional reporter's request to elaborate a narrative. He continued to refuse a pedestal, but accepted responsibility. He kept the janitor's jacket in his closet as a reminder, taking it out sometimes when a training session needed a touch of humility, or when he visited Celestia to check in on old colleagues and remind them that the work mattered as much as ever. The Cooper Foundation grew slowly but deliberately, avoiding headline-chasing projects in favor of steady support. Vivian held meetings where she would ask hard questions about outcomes, how many families had remained employed because of emergency grants, whether training reduced late-stage ER admissions for employees, whether their partnerships with community colleges created steady pipelines into health work for those who wanted them. The foundation insisted on numbers and stories in equal measure and used both to iterate its programs. One day, months after the initial storm, Adam found himself standing in a small classroom in a community center, one of the foundation's new training sites. He was teaching a group of hospitality workers how to recognize signs of respiratory distress and when to elevate a concern. At the back of the room, Marco sat, now a student in an EMT program, and when the class was over, he hugged Adam with a sincerity that nearly knocked the older man off balance. "You got me," Marco said, voice thick. "You said I had a shot. I got my certificate last week." These were the days that reframed success for Adam. Measurable movement in other people's lives, the loosening of a static economy that had once forced his choices. He measured his own success now by the routines that allowed him to come home to Emma, by the afternoons when she practiced piano and he could be there, by the way Oliver once left a crayon drawing in their mailbox with "thank you" written in shaky letters. There were social tensions he navigated. People who found it hard to believe a janitor could work in corporate structures without being exploited, or who felt that Vivian's money was trying to buy public approval. Adam learned to answer both with honesty. The foundation wasn't perfect, but it was trying. He said, more than once, that change didn't come from one night. It came from systems choosing to look, to listen, and to act. Sometimes he returned to the restaurant, not as an employee, but as a friend. The staff greeted him with a warmth that surprised him. Pierre made a point of bringing him a cup of coffee and a grin. "You ever want to clean a table for old time's sake?" Pierre joked once, and Adam laughed in the way that means you keep your history close but don't let it define you. There was a small, private moment, months later, when he and Vivian stood apart from a foundation event and watched Oliver and Emma trade secrets over a juice box. Vivian exhaled. "You know," she said, quietly, "I did not expect—" She stopped, as if grasping for the right noun. "I did not expect you to make me see what I could change." "It wasn't hard," Adam said. "You just needed someone to point out that paying attention makes systems better." She looked at him like someone seeing a truth for the first time, and then smiling a small, disarming smile. "Then let's make sure more people get pointed toward it," she said. He thought about the slap of mop rubber on tile, about nights when he'd whispered to his sleeping daughter that it was okay to breathe. He felt a tide of gratitude that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with a life becoming useful again. On the anniversary of the night Oliver came to the Celestia doorway in pain, Adam took Emma to the hospital for a routine checkup. The pediatric wing was a different kind of weather from the restaurant, cooler, softer, its urgency laced with routine. And Oliver was there, building a Lego tower with a steady hand. He waved when he saw Adam and Emma approach, the boy's smile now broad and ordinary. "You're here," Oliver said, as if pointing out a fact rather than issuing praise. He had a small scar at his side that, to eyes trained in medicine, carried the story of intervention. To Adam, it was a marker of a child's life kept whole. Emma looked at Oliver with a seriousness that made Adam smile. "Do you still like hospitals?" she asked. "A bit," Oliver admitted. "They caught my tummy." They all laughed in the way children do when they hold onto a story as evidence rather than trauma. Adam watched them and felt something settle into him that had been unsettled for years, a steady belief that attention, properly applied, could be an act of love that changed more than one life. That afternoon, as they walked back through a sunlit corridor, Adam thought of a line he had once heard in a thrift store of sermons and stories. Ordinary people can be instruments of extraordinary outcomes when they insist on seeing. He did not like grand metaphors, but even he would agree that the night had been a pivot. He had been hired to make crystals shine. He had ended up helping to make a system see. He kept a small ritual. On quiet nights, he washed his hands and looked at the scarred palms, the lines that told stories of labor, of care, of the small things he'd done to keep a child alive. He pressed the card from Vivian into the leather of his wallet sometimes, but mostly he let his days be measured in routines, training sessions, clinic meetings, Emma's laughter curling the edges of his tiredness. When he would tell the story to people who asked, neighbors, new trainees, even the occasional curious journalist, he was careful to tilt it away from heroism. "My job," he would say, "is to notice and to connect people to help. Sometimes that saves a life. Mostly it just keeps people from ever needing a headline." In the background, the foundation continued its work. Training, grants, a slow pipeline of caretakers moving into health work, and a steady collection of small stories about lives being steadied. Vivian remained a force, rigid about results and tender about people. She insisted the foundation remain accountable to those it served and refused easy PR that blunted the real labor behind the changes. As the months turned, Adam's identity settled into a careful patchwork: janitor's grit, paramedic's muscle, coordinator's patience, father's vigilance. He still polished brass sometimes when he visited Celestia, hands moving in the familiar rhythm. It kept him humble and reminded him of the dignity of labor that never wanted praise. One night, years from that first corridor, a young employee at the Hale campus came to him in tears because his child had a fever and the employee had been told to wait. Adam took him by the shoulder, set a phone to dial, and walked the man through the steps he had taught others. Ask for a priority assessment, document the timeline, pre-alert the ER. It was a small moment of policy becoming protection, procedure enacted with human warmth. When he left the office that night, the city had the same cavernous light it had when he'd first walked home from the hospital. But something about him had changed, not the circumference of his life, but the meaning of his watchfulness. He had been hired to make crystals shine, and in doing so had kept a child alive. He carried that memory not as a trophy, but as a compass. On a quiet evening, he stood in the kitchen with Emma at his hip, reading a picture book with absurd animal noises. The house smelled of reheated soup and soap. He had learned to measure his days in the smaller currencies: clean sheets, laughter at the dinner table, a child's breathing steady through the night. He had also learned that a single act of attention, made in a corridor where everyone else expected silence, could ripple outward to change systems and seed commitments. He thought, not for the first time, of the phrase that had been printed in a simple pamphlet he had once given to a training group: "Attention given is attention returned." He believed it now with a conviction that was not pious but practical. He had been supposed to remain invisible. Instead, he had become someone who had been heard and who had used the hearing to make a difference. The shock of that moment, Adam's insistence in the corridor, a janitor speaking truth to an anxious mother, had become less about surprise and more about possibility. It was a reminder that the world can be rearranged by small acts done in good faith. In the soft hush before Emma slipped to sleep, she reached up and took his hand. "Are you a hero?" she asked, an earnest inquiry that required neither myth nor defense. He looked at her, at the curve of her cheek, at the steady rise of her breath. He thought of nights in ambulances and nights at bedside monitors, of training sessions and early morning classes, of foundation meetings and the odd comfort of being needed in both the corridors of the rich and the quietly lit rooms of the clinic. "No," he said, truthfully, and then added with a smile, "but I try to do the right thing when it matters." She nodded, satisfied. The stuffed bear fell half off the couch as she shifted to find her comfortable place. He kissed the top of her head and sat with the quiet the way he had learned to sit with everything important, watchful, grateful, and present. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things.